Hey, in this video I get a chance to watch live react to videos I've never seen before. I love Brene Brown. My team has gotten a little video here, a couple videos of Brene Brown that I'm gonna watch, and I haven't seen them before. This one is vulnerability and not oversharing. What's the difference? Let's find out what she has to say.
In order for transformation to happen, in order for there to be success by any metric, money, stock price, market share, whatever your metric is, you can't get there without brave leaders and courageous cultures.
You can teach courage.
Oh, you can absolutely teach courage. 4 skill sets. Number 1 being vulnerability.
I bet you that not too many years ago, if you had corporate leaders talking about their vulnerability and discussing shame in the office place, they'd have been laughed out of the office.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's still the case in some places.
So Brene Brown is talking about metrics of performance. And she's saying, if you want to do your best in any endeavor within the business world, you have got to be courageous. And the guy says, well, is what you're going to say courageous being vulnerable? And she's saying, you can teach us. And she says, yes. And he gives the exact response that he says, I bet you if you were talking about this years ago, you'd have been laughed out of the office. And you know what? You're still getting laughed out of the office for this. People are terrified. We want people to be vulnerable, but we don't want to be vulnerable. And that's the real issue. But there is so much power when you can truly open yourself to vulnerability and honesty and be who you are, then things transform. And it is the absolute catalyst for releasing all your creative energy, all your sense of innovation. That's why this is so powerful in the world of business as well as your private life.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's still the case in some places. It's just, if you're at the top of a Fortune 500 company and your success metric depends on creativity and innovation, and you've set up a culture where vulnerability is seen as weakness, don't expect great results.
She just kind of said what I said. She says, if you're the top of a Fortune 500 company and your success is dependent on creativity and innovation, then you're not going to be successful if you can't be vulnerable. And that is the truth. It is the very essence of what creativity is vulnerability. Because creativity only comes through failure. And only comes when you can admit that failure is happening. And vulnerability is opening yourself to say, hey, I'm failing at this, or whatever that may be, right? It's the honest, open communication. It is not guarded. And she is bang on this.
Don't expect the creativity.
No, because, I mean, innovation by definition is idea, iteration, failure, iteration, failure, iteration. Places where they're doing the most remarkable kind of high risk, high reward innovating, huge tolerances for vulnerability. And so if you have leaders who are either preaching a gospel of vulnerability as weakness or modeling that, just don't expect great things.
You have said that vulnerability without boundaries is not vulnerability.
Mm-mm.
What do you mean by that? I'm not sure I understand.
When I go work with organizations, sometimes I'll hear someone say something like, how often should I cry in front of my team? And I'm like, oh my God, like, that's not what I'm saying. Vulnerability is not about, self-disclosure. Like, I know leaders who never cry, who are very vulnerable and transparent. And I know leaders who cry all the time who are just BSers. If there's, vulnerability is great. Faux vulnerability or like fake vulnerability, because vulnerability seems to be a thing right now.
Mm-hmm.
That pisses people off.
So you're not advocating for people to just put it all out there?
No, all I'm saying about vulnerability is that when you are in uncertainty, when you feel at risk, when you feel exposed, don't tap out. Stay brave,
So she makes a really great distinction, because I see this all the time too. It has kind of taken this idea of vulnerability, and what happens is people hear about the power of vulnerability and what it can do for them, and so then they approach it from an inauthentic place. What they do is they'll cry, they'll say, I'm gonna be vulnerable here for a moment, and then they start to cry and they say something that is meant to manipulate you. That is not vulnerability. That is manipulation. Vulnerability is admitting I'm in a space of uncertainty. I am admitting I don't know what to do next. That is real vulnerability. You don't need to cry. You don't need to have an emotional breakdown. And she says there are leaders that are deeply vulnerable that never cry, right? But they are open to saying, I don't know what to do next. Guys, I'm lost. Our company is failing right now. The economy has completely and utterly changed. And I don't know my next path forward. I need your help. Can we rally as a team and figure this out? That's vulnerability. It is not coming in and saying, I can't do this because my husband just got in a car accident, right? Now that may be a real thing, right? But if you're using it to get out of something, that's not vulnerability, that's manipulation. Vulnerability is the admittance of uncertainty and lack of knowledge so that you can rely on people around you to rally and support. But when you don't ever show that you don't know stuff, well, you're just pretending, right? And it's a tricky distinction. And frankly, I think you got to be prepared to fail at it. There will be times when you are trying to be vulnerable and maybe you realize at the end, oh my gosh, I just used that to manipulate. Because we're human and we screw up. But and you can apologize for that. That's the vulnerability. Guys, you know what? I said that stuff. It was out of line. I shouldn't have done it. I apologize. Teaching people how to do it, right?
Out. Stay brave, stay uncomfortable, stay in the cringy moment, lean into the hard conversation, and keep leading. Stay brave. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying you need to overshare. I'm not saying you need to disclose. I'm not saying you need to weep uncontrollably to show how human you are.
Yeah, she's saying stay brave, right? And vulnerability really is the essence of bravery. You are openly saying to somebody, I don't know what to do next. You stay in that moment. You lean into that. You stay in the uncomfortable space and you remain there until that uncomfortable space shows you the clear path out. But you don't have to overshare. You don't have to, tell things in a deeply personal space that have really no bearing on what's going on. Vulnerability, particularly in the business place, is admitting to the reality of the situation that you're in. Now, things outside your life can have an impact. For example, if your wife died, you could come in and say, look, I've had some personal things in my life that are really, really having an impact on me today. I'm having trouble focusing. I'm gonna need some help. That's vulnerability, right? That doesn't overshare. It doesn't make people want to lift you and support you in a way that is not meant to target the issue that is at hand. You've got to keep those things very clear within yourself. And that's what real vulnerability is.
I'm saying try to be aware of your armor. And when you feel vulnerable, try not to transform up. Try to stay human, keep leaning. Very different things.
Let's take a look at this next one.
So I think the biggest myth about vulnerability is that it's weakness. I think a lot of people were raised to believe that. It was modeled, I think, certainly in our culture. We see that a lot, that to be vulnerable, to be open, to be exposed is to be weak. And the truth is, what I found in my research is that vulnerability is not weakness. In fact, I would argue that it's our greatest measure of courage. When we went out and asked people, what is vulnerability? We heard things like, vulnerability is the first date after my divorce. Vulnerability is starting my own company. Vulnerability is taking responsibility for something that went wrong at work. Vulnerability is sitting with my wife who has stage 3 breast cancer and making plans for our young kids.
So she's listing examples of what people say vulnerability is, right? She's saying vulnerability is my first date after my divorce. Vulnerability is starting my own company. Vulnerability is sitting with my wife through stage 3 breast cancer. These are all really, really courageous things. That is vulnerability, right? But vulnerability has been interpreted as weakness. You know, to be vulnerable is showing weakness. And I always think of vulnerability, right? Is when a dog comes up and that dog trusts you and loves you, it will lay on its back and show its belly. And you can scratch its belly, right? That is utterly vulnerable. But it is so brave because that little dog is utterly exposed to you, and you can hurt it very, very badly in that moment. So that takes courage to expose yourself like that, right? And she's talking about this is the exposure of vulnerability. It's that brave moment where, you know what, I'm gonna start a business and it may utterly fail. And I, in fact, remember starting my own business. I was lying in bed in the hospital. The doctor said, I don't know if he's gonna make it through the night. And my first thought to myself was, oh my gosh, I'm not afraid to die, and I haven't started my own business. And I did. I committed to myself to start my own company the moment I got out of bed. It was courageous. And I think we all need to be courageous in that way. It's a different kind of courage. But the armor that we put up to protect ourselves from being vulnerable, she talks about this, is not courage. It is fear. And you're protecting yourself from that moment where you can actually achieve great creativity and unleash innovation. So learn to be vulnerable. It is your power. It is brave. And it makes people creative and innovative, which is what we need now more than any other time in the history of the world, because change is happening so rapidly. Vulnerability will make you innovative and creative in every space of your life. Stick around, I got another video coming up where I react to couples secretly sharing their most vulnerable moments. It's a nice one. I'm James Burnham, thanks for joining me.